You think you know the man living in that quiet house at the end of Oak Street, the one who walks his dogs every morning, the one who seems so vulnerable with his white cane tapping against the sidewalk? What if I told you that the man you see as Helpless was once the most feared K-9 unit commander in Afghanistan, a man who turned enemy strongholds into his personal hunting grounds, and those 3 German shepherds aren't just pets. They're highly trained military assets with a body count higher than most soldiers. Hit that subscribe button because, trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. David Marshall stood quietly on his front porch, his enhanced hearing picking up every subtle sound in the morning air, from the rustling leaves to the distant rumble of traffic, his fingers absently running through the thick fur of Atlas. His lead dog, the familiar morning ritual, brought him a sense of peace. Though his world had gone dark years ago, his other senses had sharpened. To an almost superhuman degree beside him, Rex and Shadow sat alert, their powerful bodies coiled with restrained energy. These weren't ordinary dogs. Their training went far beyond basic obedience. They were weapons, precisely honed instruments of war. The neighborhood was peaceful suburban tranquility at its finest. Most people saw David as the quiet, blind veteran who kept to himself. They'd wave as they passed by, sometimes stopping to chat, but always with that hint of pity in their voices that he could hear so clearly if they only knew the truth about the man they thought needed their sympathy. But David had learned long ago to let people think what they wanted. Sometimes being underestimated was the greatest advantage of all. Especially in his line of work, the familiar sound of Mrs. Henderson's voice carried across the street. "Good morning, David," she called out, her footsteps approaching. "Would you like some help with anything today?" David smiled politely in her direction, his unseeing eyes hidden behind dark glasses. "No, thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I'm managing just fine." Atlas, Rex, and Shadow sat perfectly still, their training evident in every line of their bodies. Most people thought they were just well-behaved pets. They had no idea these dogs had been through the same rigorous training as their handler, had survived the same battles, shared the same nightmares. David's mind wandered momentarily to his days in Afghanistan, the sound of gunfire, the smell of cordite, the way his unit had moved through hostile territory like ghosts in the night. His dogs always by his side. They had been legendary. The K-9 unit that could breach any compound, take down any target, leave no trace behind. But that was before the IED, before the blast that had taken his sight, though not his spirit. The military had wanted to retire his dogs along with him, but David had refused. They were more than just military assets. They were his family, and he had made sure they stayed together. The sound of a motorcycle engine in the distance caught his attention, different from the usual traffic patterns he had memorized. These weren't ordinary bikes. The deep rumble of custom pipes, the aggressive rev of engines pushed beyond factory specs. David's highly trained ears picked up details others would miss. This was trouble coming their way. He could feel it in his bones. The dogs sensed it too, their bodies tensing slightly. Atlas letting out a low, almost inaudible growl. David had heard about the recent gang activity in the area, the rising tension, the increasing boldness of the local motorcycle club. They had been pushing into new territory, marking their presence with increasing violence. Most people tried to avoid them, tried to stay out of their way. But David wasn't most people. He had faced far worse in the mountains of Afghanistan, had tracked enemies through terrain that would make these streets seem like a playground. The dogs, too, had faced down opponents far more dangerous than any local gang. The motorcycles grew closer, their engines echoing off the houses. David could hear 5, no 6 distinct bikes. The riders confident, aggressive in their approach. They were looking for something or someone. His enhanced hearing picked up their conversation as they rolled past his house, checking out the neighborhood like predators sizing up their prey. But David knew better than to show any reaction. He remained still calm, his dogs perfectly controlled beside him. Years of training had taught him the value of patience, of letting the enemy think they had the upper hand. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried across the street again, this time tinged with worry. Those awful men, she Muttered they've been causing so much trouble lately. David nodded slightly, acknowledging her concern but saying nothing. His mind was already working, analyzing the situation, mapping out contingencies. The gang's presence wasn't a coincidence. They were expanding their territory, and his quiet neighborhood was their newest target. The dogs picked up on his subtle shift in mood, their bodies coiling with barely contained energy. They had been through countless missions with him, had learned to read his every signal to the outside world. David Marshall was just another disabled veteran trying to live a quiet life with his service dogs. But beneath that carefully constructed facade lay a warrior who had never truly left the battlefield. His blindness hadn't weakened him. It had made him stronger, forced him to develop his other senses to a degree that sometimes seemed supernatural. The gang members who had just rolled through his neighborhood had no idea who they were dealing with. No concept of the training, the experience, the lethal capability that lay behind those dark glasses. David's fingers found Atlas's ear, scratching gently. The dog leaned into his touch, a gesture of affection that belied its deadly training. These dogs weren't just companions, they were extensions of his will. Weapons that could be deployed with surgical precision, each one capable of taking down armed opponents with ruthless efficiency. They had been through hell together, had faced death countless times, and had always emerged victorious now as the sound of motorcycles faded into the distance. David couldn't help but wonder if his peaceful retirement was about to be interrupted. The morning sun warmed his face as he stood there, listening, feeling the subtle vibrations through the ground that told him more about his surroundings than most people could see. With their eyes, the gang would be back of that. He was certain they had been testing the waters exploring their new hunting ground, but they would soon learn that they weren't the hunters here. They were the prey. They just didn't know it yet. David Marshall might be blind, but he could see things others couldn't, could sense danger before it struck, and when it did, he and his dogs would be ready. Deep down, he knew this calm wouldn't last the peaceful mornings, the quiet routine. It was all just the prelude to something darker, something that would force him to unleash the carefully controlled violence that he and his dogs were capable of. The gang had made their presence known, had marked their territory, but they had no idea what kind of force they were about to encounter. David's lips curved into a slight smile as he turned to head inside his dogs, moving in perfect formation. Beside him, some storms were worth waiting for. The days in David Marshall's neighborhood followed a predictable pattern, a rhythm he had carefully memorized and monitored like everything else in his life. After losing his sight, he had learned to create order from chaos, to find patterns in the seemingly random flow of daily life at precisely 7:30 a.m. He would begin his morning routine, his dogs already alert and waiting by the time his feet touched the floor. Military discipline hadn't left him even years after his service had ended. His modest house at the end of Oak Street was meticulously organized. Every object in its exact place, nothing left to chance, nothing that could trip him up or cause confusion. Atlas, Rex, and Shadow moved through the space with him, their bodies always in perfect position to assist if needed. Though he rarely required their help, his enhanced other senses had more than compensated for his lost vision. The house itself was a testament to adaptation. Every room designed for maximum efficiency, with subtle, tactile markers that only he could detect. The morning walk was more than just exercise. It was reconnaissance. David's way of maintaining awareness of his territory, the dogs moved in formation. Atlas on his left, Rex on his right, and Shadow bringing up the rear, their movements synchronized with his own, their paws silent on the concrete as they patrolled their neighborhood. Other residents often commented on how well-behaved his dogs were. But they missed the subtle signs, the way the animals constantly scanned their surroundings, the practiced precision of their movements. Local children would sometimes stop to watch, fascinated by the big dogs and their blind owner. "Hey, Mr. Marshall." They would call out, their voices filled with curiosity and wonder. David would always acknowledge them with a warm smile, carefully masking the warrior that lay beneath the surface. The dogs never broke formation, never wavered from their protective positions. Even when small hands reached out to pat their heads, they had been trained to maintain their guard while appearing completely approachable. It was a delicate balance, one they had mastered years ago. The local coffee shop was his first regular stop of the day. The bell above the door chiming softly as he entered, the scent of fresh coffee and baked goods filling the air morning. "Sarah," he would say to the young barista, who always worked the morning shift. She had long since stopped being amazed at how he knew it was her. "Your usual Mr. Marshall," she would ask, though she already knew the answer. "Large black coffee, 3 dog. Biscuits." The routine never varied. The dogs would sit perfectly still by his table as he enjoyed his coffee, their eyes constantly moving, scanning the room for any potential threats. Other regulars at the coffee shop had grown used to his presence, though they never quite understood why such a quiet man needed 3 massive German shepherds. They didn't see the way the dogs positioned themselves for maximum coverage of the space, didn't notice how their ears would track every movement, every conversation, their training far too sophisticated to give away their constant state of alertness. David could sense their curiosity, feel the weight of their stares, but he had learned to ignore it long ago. The rest of his morning would unfold with military precision. A visit to the local market where the owner, Mr. Chen, always had his groceries prepared in advance. A stop at the park where the dogs would maintain their training exercises, disguised as simple play, and finally, a careful patrol. Of the neighborhood perimeter, David had mapped every inch of his territory in his mind, knew every crack in the sidewalk, every subtle change in elevation. His fingers light on Atlas's harness more for appearance than necessity today, though something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a subtle shift in the normal patterns of the neighborhood. David could sense it in the way people moved, in the hushed conversations that stopped when he passed by. The dogs felt it too. Their muscles, slightly more tense, their movements more deliberate, word had spread about the motorcycle gang, their presence casting a shadow over the community's usual tranquility. David had heard the rumors of protection money demanded from local businesses, of threats made against those who refused to comply. Mrs. Chen at the market had been unusually quiet that morning, her usual cheerful greeting subdued. David could hear the stress in her voice, the slight tremor that spoke of fear she didn't voice. "These thugs, they came yesterday," she finally confided, her voice barely above a whisper. "Said, we need to pay for protection." David nodded slowly, his unseeing eyes hidden behind dark glasses, but his mind was already working, analyzing the threat assessment. The implications. The dogs shifted slightly, responding to his subtle change in posture. Throughout the day, David maintained his routine, but his awareness was heightened. Every sound, every vibration, every subtle shift in the air around him carried, meaning the dogs too were more alert. Their training showing in the way they monitored their surroundings with increased intensity. To anyone watching, they would have appeared no different than usual. But David knew better, could feel the coiled energy in their bodies, the readiness for action that came from years of combat experience. As the sun began to set, David sat on his front porch, his enhanced hearing picking up the distant sound of motorcycles again, different from the morning group. These engines were tuned for speed, their riders more aggressive in their approach. The dogs lay at his feet, appearing relaxed, but their bodies were tense, ready. David's fingers absently traced the scars on his forearm, reminders of the war that had taken his sight, but had given him something else in return, a different kind of vision, one that saw through darkness and deception. The neighborhood was changing. He could feel it in the way people hurried past, in the nervous energy that permeated the air. The gang was making their presence known, marking their territory like wolves closing in on their prey. But they had no idea what waited for them here. No concept of the training, the experience, the lethal capability that lay dormant behind. The facade of a blind veteran and his service dogs. David Marshall had faced worse enemies, had overcome greater challenges, and if these thugs wanted to threaten his community, they would soon learn why he and his dogs had been legendary in Afghanistan. The first signs of real trouble arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. David sat at his usual table in Sarah's coffee shop, Atlas, Rex, and Shadow arranged in their standard formation around him, when the bell above the door chimed differently than usual, the sound followed by the heavy tread of motorcycle boots and the creak of leather jackets. The atmosphere in the shop immediately shifted, attention falling over the usual afternoon crowd. David could hear heartbeats quickening, chairs scraping slightly as people tried to make themselves smaller, less noticeable. 3 men had entered, their footsteps echoing with deliberate heaviness. Sarah's breathing hitched slightly as they approached the counter, the subtle sound telling David everything he needed to know about their demeanor. Their presence was meant to intimidate, and it was working. "Nice place you got here," one of them said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a predator toying with its prey. Shame, if anything happened. To it, David remained still. His posture relaxed, but his senses were heightened, cataloging every sound, every movement, every subtle shift in the air. The dogs hadn't moved, but David could feel the change in them, their muscles tensing imperceptibly, beneath their fur, years of training keeping them perfectly still despite their readiness to act. Atlas, positioned closest to him, let out a breath so soft only David could hear it, a signal they had practiced countless times in combat, indicating the position of potential threats. The middle one armed David's mind, supplied automatically, picking up the subtle sound of metal against leather when the man shifted his weight. Sarah's voice trembled slightly as she responded, "I've already told. Your friends, we don't want any trouble." The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Trouble," he said. "That's exactly what we're trying to help you avoid, right, boys?" His companions grunted in agreement, their boots scuffing against the floor as they spread out. Taking positions that David recognized from his military days, they were establishing dominance, controlling the space, just as he had once taught his own units to do. The tension in the room thickened as the leader leaned over the counter. David could hear the subtle creak of wood as the man put his weight on it, smell the mixture of leather oil and cigarette smoke that clung to him. "You see," he continued, his voice dripping with mock concern, "our organization provides valuable services to local businesses. Protection insurance, you might call it." Sarah's heart rate spiked. David could hear it even from across the room. "And now it's time for you to start paying your dues." The other customers in the shop had gone completely silent, their fear palpable in the air. David took another sip of his coffee, his movements deliberately slow and controlled. He had faced far worse situations, had learned that true power often lay in stillness, in the ability to wait for the perfect moment. The dogs mirrored his calm, their training allowing them to remain perfectly still, despite their readiness to explode into action at his command. Atlas's ears twitched slightly, tracking the movements of the men while appearing to sleep. Look, Sarah's voice was stronger now, though David could still hear the underlying tremor. "I told your boss yesterday, I'm not interested in your protection. I don't need it." The sound of a fist hitting the counter made several customers jump, the sharp crack echoing through the suddenly silent shop. "That's not how this works, sweetheart." The leader's voice had lost its false friendliness. "You don't get to decide what you need, we do. And right now, you need to understand how serious we are." David's fingers tightened. Slightly on his coffee cup, the only outward sign of his response to the threat, the dogs picked up on his subtle shift, their muscles coiling imperceptibly beneath their fur. He had known this moment would come, had been preparing for it since he first heard the motorcycles in his neighborhood, but he also knew timing was everything in Afghanistan. He had learned that rushing in without proper assessment could be fatal. The same principle applied here. The leader was still talking, his voice growing more threatening with each word. But David was focused on the movements of the other 2 men. They were professionals, or at least had some training, their footsteps too deliberate, their positioning too tactical for ordinary thugs. One had moved near the door, controlling the exit. The other was slowly circling the room, his boots making soft scuffing sounds against the floor that told David exactly where he was at all times. When the sound of shattering ceramic cut through the air, David knew they had escalated to property damage. He could hear the pieces of what had been a coffee mug hitting the floor. Sarah's sharp intake of breath, the murmured fears of the other. "Customers next time, it won't be just a cup," the leader said, his voice cold. "That's just a little demonstration of what happens to people who don't appreciate our services. You've got 24 hours to reconsider your position." The men moved toward the door, their boots heavy against the floor, confident in their display of power. As they passed David's table, the one in the rear paused. "Hey, check out the blind guy with his puppies," he snorted. "What's wrong, old man? Can't see how the world really works?" David didn't respond, didn't move, but he catalogued everything about the man's voice, his position, the slight wheeze in his breathing that suggested a smoker. The way he favored his left leg, probably an old injury. The dogs remained still, but alert, their training preventing any reaction to the provocation. As the bell chimed again, signaling the gang's departure, the tension in the shop began to dissipate slightly, though fear still hung heavy in the air. David could hear Sarah's shaky breathing, the nervous murmurs of the other customers, the sound of a broom sweeping up broken ceramic. He remained seated, his unseeing eyes hidden behind dark glasses, while his mind worked through scenarios and contingencies he had hoped it wouldn't come. To this had hoped the gang would pass over their neighborhood, but now he knew better. The dogs shifted slightly, their bodies realigning as they sensed his decision. Atlas pressed against his leg, a gentle reminder of their presence, of their readiness. These men had no idea what they were dealing with, no concept of the forces they were about to unleash. David had spent years cultivating the image of a helpless blind veteran, but that image was about to shatter just like the coffee mug they had. Destroyed, and when it did, these men would learn why he and his dogs had been the most feared K-9 unit in Afghanistan. The next few days brought a subtle shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere, a tension that grew thicker with each passing hour. David could sense it, in the way people moved in their hushed conversations, in the nervous energy that seemed to permeate every corner of his territory. The gang had made their presence known, and now they were watching, waiting like wolves circling their prey. But they weren't the only ones observing. David's heightened senses picked up every detail, every change in the normal patterns of life. The coffee shop had become quieter. Sarah's usually bustling morning crowd dwindling as people sought to avoid potential confrontation. David maintained his routine, refusing to show any sign that the situation affected him. The dogs remained vigilant, their training allowing them to appear relaxed while maintaining constant surveillance. Atlas Rex and Shadow had been through too many combat situations to give away their alertness, but David could feel their readiness in the way they positioned themselves, their bodies always between him and potential threats. Mrs. Henderson stopped by his porch. One morning, her usual cheerful greeting subdued David. "They're demanding money from everyone now," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The Chens, the coffee shop, even old Mr. Peterson at the hardware store." David nodded slowly, taking in the information. The dogs shifted imperceptibly around him, responding to the subtle tension in his posture. "There are rumors," she continued. "They hurt Jimmy's boy last night, when his father refused to pay, just a warning. They said, but the poor boy's arm is broken." David's fingers tightened slightly on Atlas's harness, the only outward sign of his response to this news. The dog pressed against his leg, a gesture of solidarity they had developed during their time in combat, when words weren't safe, but communication was vital. Mrs. Henderson didn't notice this exchange, too caught up in her fear and worry. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The police. They say they can't help, not without evidence." The sound of motorcycles in the distance made Mrs. Henderson fall silent. David's enhanced hearing picked up the details. 5 bikes moving slowly through the neighborhood, a patrol marking territory. The gang was growing bolder, their presence more overt with each passing day. "They're coming," she whispered, fear evident in her voice. "I should go." David waited, listening, as her hurried footsteps carried her away, the bikes growing louder as they approached his house. This time they slowed as they passed his property, their engines growling like predators. David could hear their conversations carried on the wind. "Hey, isn't that the blind guy with the dogs?" one voice said, followed by low laughter. "Yeah, I heard about him. Some kind of veteran lives alone might be worth paying him a visit." The dogs remained perfectly still, but David could feel the shift in their energy, the way their muscles tensed. Preparing for action, they had faced far more dangerous enemies, had taken down armed insurgents in pitch darkness. But these men didn't know that, couldn't see the lethal capability hidden beneath the surface. The bikes circled the block twice more, each pass slower, more deliberate. They were testing boundaries. Looking for weaknesses, David knew this tactic had employed it himself in different circumstances. When tracking enemy movements in hostile territory, the gang was establishing dominance through presence, through the threat of violence, but they had no idea they were being assessed just as carefully by someone far more experienced in the art of warfare. Later that afternoon, David made his way to the local market, the dogs moving in perfect formation beside him. Inside, he could hear Mr. Chen arguing with someone, his usual calm voice raised in distress. "Please, I need more time, just a few more days." The response came sharp and threatening. "You've had plenty of time, old man. Tomorrow or things get ugly." David paused in the doorway, his presence causing a sudden silence in the conversation. He could smell leather and oil, hear the subtle shift of heavy boots on the floor. "Watch where you're going, blind man." A rough voice growled as someone shouldered past him. David didn't move, didn't react, but his mind catalogued everything about the man's movement, his gait, the way he favored his right side, the slight catch in his breathing. These weren't just thugs. They were organized, had training, perhaps military backgrounds themselves. It would explain their tactical approach, their understanding of psychological warfare, but they were sloppy, overconfident, and that would be their downfall. Mr. Chen's voice was shaky when he greeted David. "I'm sorry, Mr. Marshall, but we're closed today." David nodded, understanding the unspoken message, the fear in the old man's voice. "No problem. Mr. Chen," he said calmly, "I'll come back tomorrow." The dogs moved with him as he turned to leave, their bodies tense with controlled energy. They had sensed the threat, recognized the potential for violence, but their training held them in check, waiting for his command as they walked home. David's mind worked through scenarios and contingencies he had hoped to avoid. Confrontation had wanted to maintain his peaceful existence. But the gang was escalating, pushing harder, threatening the vulnerable members of his community. They had made a critical error in their assessment of the neighborhood's residents, had seen the blind veteran with his dogs as just another potential victim. They would learn their mistakes soon enough. The afternoon sun was setting when David heard another motorcycle, this one alone, moving slowly past his house twice. 3 times the rider was watching, studying, probably reporting back to their leaders. David sat on his porch, appearing relaxed, unconcerned, but his senses were fully engaged, tracking the bike's movement, analyzing the rider's patterns. The dogs lay at his feet, looking peaceful, but their bodies were coiled, ready. His fingers found Atlas's ear, scratching gently, a gesture that to anyone watching would appear affectionate, but was actually a silent signal they had used countless times in combat. The bike made one final pass before roaring away, but David knew this wasn't the end. It was merely the prelude. The gang was gathering intelligence, planning their next move. They saw his blindness as a weakness, an easy target. They had no idea that darkness was his element, that he and his dogs had learned to turn blindness into an advantage, had perfected the art of fighting without sight long before he lost his vision. The quiet neighborhood was about to become a hunting ground, but not in the way the gang intended. David stood in his garage that evening, his fingers moving with practiced precision over the hidden compartment he had installed years ago, memories of Afghanistan flooding back as he accessed the secure storage space, the familiar weight of his old military gear bringing with it echoes of past Missions nights spent in hostile territory, where only his training and his dogs had stood between life and death. While the neighborhood slept unaware, he prepared himself mentally and physically for what he knew was coming. The garage itself was a testament to his preparation, years of tactical planning hidden beneath the appearance of ordinary storage, carefully concealed caches of equipment, specialized gear, and the custom modifications he had designed after losing his sight, all arranged in a system only he could navigate. Atlas watched from his position by the door, while Rex and Shadow patrolled the perimeter. Their movements silent, efficient, just as they had been trained. The dogs understood the significance of this moment, could sense the shift in their handler's energy. His fingers traced the edge of his old tactical vest, memories of desert operations and mountain warfare rising unbidden in his mind. The vest had been modified after his injury, enhanced, with subtle tactile markers that allowed him to access equipment by touch, alone each pocket. Each attachment point carefully designed to be identified without sight. Beside it lay the specialized equipment he had developed during his last years, of service tools that had turned his blindness from a weakness into a strength. The sound of Sarah's scream cut through his thoughts, distant but clear. Even through the walls of his garage, David's enhanced hearing picked up the commotion from the coffee shop 2 blocks away, the roar of motorcycles, the sharp crack of breaking glass. The dogs were instantly alert, their bodies rigid with controlled energy. Atlas let out a low whine, a signal they had developed to indicate immediate threat. David's hand found the dog's head, steadying him. This wasn't their moment. Not yet. As he listened, David could piece together the scene. The gang had returned to Sarah's shop after hours. This time they weren't just making threats. They were sending a message to the entire neighborhood. His fingers clenched around the tactical vest, remembering similar nights in Afghanistan, when he had to wait for the right moment to strike. Patience had been drilled into him through years of special operations even. Now, with his blood boiling at the sound of Sarah's distress, he maintained his control. More memories surfaced unbidden, the training grounds where he and his dogs had learned to work as one unit, the endless drills that had honed their skills, the missions that had forged them into something more than just a handler and his canines. They had become legends in the field. The blind operator whose other senses had become so acute he could track enemy movements by sound alone, and his dogs who could take down heavily armed opponents with terrifying efficiency. The dogs shifted restlessly, picking up on his tension but maintaining their discipline. Rex and Shadow had returned to their positions, flanking the garage door, their ears forward, tracking every sound from the street, while Atlas pressed against David's leg, grounding him, keeping him focused. These weren't just trained military dogs, they were extensions of his will, weapons that had been through hell with him, had adapted to his blindness. Just as he had learned to function without sight, David's mind drifted to his last mission, the operation that had cost him his vision, but it also revealed the true extent of his capabilities. He and his dogs had been tracking a high-value target through mountain caves. When the IED detonated, the blast had taken his sight. But in those moments of darkness, as he fought to survive, his other senses had awakened, had sharpened to nearly superhuman levels, the dogs adapting instantly to his new condition, guiding him, fighting alongside him until the mission was complete. The sounds from the coffee shop had died down, replaced by the rumble of motorcycles moving through the streets. David could hear the gang members laughing, their voices carried on the night air. He tracked their movement through the neighborhood, memorizing their patterns, the way they clustered together, their probable leadership structure, his tactical mind analyzing every detail, just as he had done countless times in combat zones across the world. Atlas's ears twitched, tracking something beyond human hearing, and David tensed slightly. The dog had always been able to sense trouble before it materialized, a skill that had saved their lives more than once. In the field now, as they stood in the quiet garage, that same instinct was warning them. The gang wasn't finished. They were moving with purpose, establishing dominance over their new territory. But they had made a critical error in their assessment. David's fingers found the modified combat knife he had carried through countless missions. Its weight familiar. Comforting, the blade had been balanced specifically for throwing, guided by sound rather than sight. a skill he had perfected after losing his vision. Beside it lay the rest of his specialized gear, each piece adapted to work with his enhanced other senses, the equipment that had made him more dangerous after his injury, not less. The dogs watched him intently as he began his preparations, their training allowing them to remain perfectly still. Despite their readiness for action, they had been through this routine countless times in far more dangerous situations. Had learned to read his every movement, every subtle signal. Years of combat operations had turned them into something far more lethal than ordinary military dogs. They were weapons, precisely honed instruments of warfare disguised as service animals. As he worked, David's mind continued to process the intelligence he had gathered over the past few days. The gang's patterns, their tactics, their weaknesses. They were organized, yes, had some military background perhaps, but they were overconfident, sloppy in their execution. They saw the neighborhood as easy prey, saw him as a vulnerable, blind veteran with some pets. They had no idea they were dealing with the most decorated K-9 unit commander in special operations. History had no concept of the lethal capability. Hidden behind those dark glasses, the familiar weight of his gear settled onto him, muscle memory taking over as he checked each piece by touch. Alone, Atlas, Rex, and Shadow moved closer, their bodies vibrating with controlled energy they could sense. The change in him, the warrior, emerging from behind the facade of disability. The blind veteran was disappearing, replaced by the operator, who had earned a reputation that still circulated in whispered stories among Special Forces units, the Invisible Hunter. They had called him the man who could track enemies through complete darkness, who could strike without being seen. The breaking point came faster than even David had anticipated. It wasn't just the escalating violence or the growing fear. In the neighborhood, it was a single moment that shattered any possibility of peaceful resolution. The gang had crossed a line, and there would be no going back. David had been sitting on his porch that evening when he heard the commotion at the Chen's market. The sound of breaking glass, angry voices, and Mrs. Chen's terrified scream cutting through the quiet night air. Atlas's head snapped up instantly. Rex and Shadow already moving into defensive positions, their training kicking in as David rose from his chair. The dogs had been through enough combat situations to know when the moment of action had arrived, their bodies tense with controlled energy. But David held them in check with a subtle hand signal, his enhanced hearing painting. A crystal clear picture of the scene unfolding 2 blocks away. The gang had finally made their move. Leave him alone. Mrs. Chen's voice carried on the wind. Please. He needs a doctor. David's jaw tightened as he processed the sounds of struggle. Mr. Chen's labored breathing, the cruel laughter of the gang members, the scuff of boots on concrete they had attacked. The old man had decided to make an example of someone they perceived as weak. You should have paid up when you had the chance. A rough voice growled. Now everyone's going to learn what happens when you don't show proper respect. The dogs pressed closer to David, their muscles coiled beneath thick fur, ready to explode into action. But still they waited years of training, holding them in perfect control. David's mind raced through scenarios, calculating angles of approach, analyzing the tactical situation. Just as he had done countless times in combat, he could hear at least 6 distinct voices from the gang, their positions, their movements. All crystal clear to his enhanced senses, they were arranged in a loose semicircle around their victim, confident in their dominance of the situation. A sharp cry of pain, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground, made David's decision. For him, Mr. Chen had been like a father figure. To many in the neighborhood, had always treated David with respect and dignity, had never shown a trace of pity for his blindness. Now he was paying the price for standing up to the gang's extortion. David's fingers found Atlas's harness not for guidance, but for the tactical commands they had developed during their time in special operations. Next came a sound that made David's blood run cold, the distinct click of a switchblade being opened. Maybe we should leave a more permanent reminder. One of the gang members suggested, his voice dripping with cruel anticipation. The others laughed, their boots scraping against concrete as they moved to get a better view. David could hear Mrs. Chen's desperate pleading, the gang members' taunting responses, the way Mr. Chen's breathing had become shallow and rapid with fear. That was the moment. All pretense of restraint vanished. David moved with fluid grace, his blindness forgotten. As years of combat training took over, the dogs responding instantly to his silent commands. They had been through worse situations, had faced more dangerous enemies, but the principle remained the same. Protect the innocent, neutralize the threat. Atlas, Rex, and Shadow fell into formation, their movements synchronized with his own, as they began making their way toward the market. Gang's voices grew louder, more distinct as David approached each sound, each echo, painting a detailed picture in his mind. He could track their positions, their movements, the way they had surrounded their victims, arrogant in their perceived power. They never noticed the shadow moving through the darkness, never sensed the predator that was stalking them. The dogs moved like ghosts, their paws silent on the pavement, their training allowing them to blend perfectly with the shadows. David's enhanced. Hearing picked up every detail, the way one gang member shifted his weight, betraying an old injury. The subtle wheeze in another's breathing, suggesting a smoker. The slight tremor in a third's voice indicating uncertainty. These weren't hardened criminals. They were bullies who had never faced real opposition, who had no concept of true warfare, the kind David and his dogs had lived through. "You're gonna learn, old man." One of them was saying, "We own this neighborhood." Now the words were cut short by a sudden gasp of surprise as David stepped into view, the dogs arrayed around him in perfect tactical formation, their presence alone causing the gang members to take an instinctive step back. Well, what do we have here?" the leader sneered. "Trying to maintain his bravado, looks like the blind man wants to play hero." David remained still, his unseeing eyes hidden behind dark glasses, but his other senses were in overdrive, mapping every sound, every movement, every subtle shift in the air. Gang's confidence began to waver slightly as they took in the sight before them. This wasn't the helpless, blind veteran they had observed from a distance. Something about his stance, his presence, the way his dogs moved with military precision set off warning bells in their primitive hindbrain. "You should walk away now," David said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to commanding in combat situations. "This is your only warning." Laughter erupted from the gang, though. David could hear the undertone of uncertainty in it, or what the leader demanded. "You and your puppy's gonna teach us a lesson. You can't even see what's in front of you, old man." David's lips curved in a slight smile that held no warmth, no humor. "I don't need to see," he replied softly, "to know exactly where each of you is standing, exactly how to take you down." The gang members exchanged glances, their earlier confidence beginning to crack in the face of his calm certainty. That was the final threshold, the moment when violence became inevitable. David could hear it in the way the gang leader's breathing changed, in the subtle shift of weight that preceded aggressive action. "You're gonna regret this, old man," the leader snarled. "One of you ain't enough to handle all of us, even with your dogs." David didn't move, didn't react, but his mind was already several steps ahead. They had made their choice, had crossed the line that separated intimidation from assault, and now they would learn why he and his dogs had been legendary in Afghanistan. What came next happened so fast the gang members barely had time to register. The change in David's demeanor gone, was the quiet, blind veteran replaced in an instant by something else entirely, something lethal. As the leader lunged forward, switchblade glinting in the streetlight, David moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for a blind man, his body shifting just enough to let the blade pass harmlessly by, while his hand shot out with devastating precision, finding the exact point on the attacker's wrist that sent paralyzing pain shooting up his arm. The knife clattered to the ground, but David was already moving, his enhanced hearing tracking every opponent, his body responding with the muscle memory of countless combat operations. Atlas, Rex, and Shadow exploded into action, their years of military training evident in every movement. They weren't attacking randomly like ordinary dogs. These were coordinated strikes, precise takedowns executed. With military efficiency, the gang members found themselves facing an opponent they couldn't comprehend. "Get him," someone shouted, but the voice cracked with uncertainty as they watched their leader stumble backward, clutching his now useless arm. David stood in their midst, his unseeing eyes hidden behind dark glasses, but his other senses painting a perfect picture of the chaos unfolding around him. The dogs moved like extensions of his will, each one targeting specific threats with devastating effectiveness. Atlas had already taken down 2 gang members, his powerful jaws locked onto one man's arm, while Rex and Shadow coordinated their attacks, cutting off any escape routes. David's movements were a study in lethal efficiency, every strike, every block guided by sound and air pressure rather than sight. He could hear the subtle shift of weight that preceded each attack, could sense the desperation mounting in his opponents as they realized they were hopelessly outmatched. One gang member tried to circle behind him, but David was already turning the sound of the man's leather jacket, giving away his position. A quick, precise strike to the solar plexus, followed by a sweep of the legs, and another opponent was down. The dogs worked in perfect synchronization with their handler, their attacks coordinated and precise. These weren't random bites, but carefully targeted strikes designed to incapacitate without killing. The result of years of specialized military training. Atlas had taken down his third opponent, the man's screams cutting off in a choke as the dog's weight drove him to the ground. Rex and Shadow had isolated 2 more, forcing them into a corner, their growls carrying the promise of violence, but holding back, waiting for David's command. "You're not human." One of the remaining gang members gasped, his voice shaking with fear as he watched his companions fall. David didn't respond, didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any words could. Atlas pressed against his leg. Briefly, a tactical signal they had developed in combat alert, ting him to movement on his left. Without hesitation, David's hand shot out, catching an attempted surprise attack and turning it against his attacker, the man's own momentum sending him crashing into a wall. The gang's coordination had completely broken down now, their earlier confidence shattered by the revelation that they were dealing with something far beyond their experience. These weren't the actions of a helpless blind man. This was military precision, the kind of fighting that could only come from years of special operations training. The dogs moved with similar deadly grace, their attacks synchronized with David's movements, creating a deadly dance that the gang members couldn't hope to counter. One of the last standing gang members backed away, his boots scraping against concrete as he tried to retreat, but Shadow was already there, the dog's powerful frame blocking his escape route. David could hear the man's panicked breathing, the way his heart raced with primitive fear. You think the leader gasped from where he lay clutching his injured arm. You think this is over. David turned toward the sound, his movements calculated, precise. This was over the moment you decided to prey on innocent people. He said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to commanding in combat. Atlas, Rex, and Shadow held their positions, their bodies still vibrating with controlled energy, ready to launch into action again at the slightest signal from their handler. But the fight had gone out of the gang. They lay scattered across the pavement, some groaning in pain, others too shocked to move, their worldview completely shattered by what they had just witnessed. David stood among them, his presence radiating a calm, deadly certainty that seemed to fill the entire street. Mrs. Chen had stopped screaming, her breath coming in short gasps as she helped her husband to his feet. David could hear their movements, the way Mr. Chen leaned heavily on his wife. "Impossible." The old man whispered, the words carried clearly to David's enhanced hearing. You're blind." But how David didn't answer immediately, his attention still focused on the defeated gang members, ensuring there would be no last desperate attempts at retaliation. The dogs maintained their positions, their training holding them in perfect check, despite the adrenaline still coursing through their bodies. Being blind doesn't mean being helpless. David finally said, his voice carrying clearly in the now quiet street some of us learned to see in different ways. The gang members who were still conscious shifted uncomfortably. Their earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of what they had witnessed. This wasn't just a fight. This was a demonstration of something beyond their comprehension. A blind man and his dogs had just systematically taken apart their entire group with military precision. David's enhanced hearing picked up the sound of approaching sirens. Someone in the neighborhood had finally called the police, but he knew the immediate threat had been neutralized. The gang's reputation, their illusion of invincibility, had been shattered in spectacular fashion. Atlas pressed against his leg again this time, a gesture of completion. They had faced far worse threats together, had survived countless combat missions. But this fight had served a different purpose. It had revealed what lay beneath the surface, had shown these predators that they had chosen the wrong territory to hunt in. The night seemed to hold its breath, the aftermath of violence hanging heavy in the air as the gang members lay scattered across the pavement. Groaning and defeated, David stood motionless in their midst, his dogs maintaining their positions with military precision. The sirens were growing closer, but he remained calm, centered, his enhanced hearing tracking every movement, every shallow breath of his fallen opponents. This wasn't over. Not yet. He could sense the last remnants of resistance in some of them, the desperate calculations of cornered predators. Snake, the gang's leader, struggled to his feet, his earlier confidence shattered, but desperation making him dangerous. David could hear the man's ragged breathing, the way he favored his injured arm, the slight shift of gravel under his boots as he tried to find stable footing. "You think this changes anything?" the leader spat. But his voice trembled, betraying his fear. "You're dead, you hear me, all of you." David didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in. Atlas, Rex, and Shadow remained perfectly still, their bodies coiled with lethal energy, ready to explode into action again at the slightest signal they had taken down. Armed opponents before had faced far more dangerous situations in combat zones across the world. But this was different. This was about sending a message. The gang needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with. Who they had chosen to challenge. David could hear some of the other gang members beginning to stir, their movements weak, uncoordinated. "You don't understand, do you, David?" said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded special operations units in the worst combat zones on Earth. "This isn't about just tonight. This isn't about you or your gang. This is about making sure you never threaten this community again." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise. Snake's breath caught slightly as the full impact of David's presence, his capability, finally registered. This wasn't just some blind veteran who had gotten lucky. This was something else entirely. The sound of a knife being drawn cut through the tension. One of the gang members had managed to retrieve a weapon. David's head turned slightly, tracking the sound with inhuman precision before any of the fallen gang members could react. Atlas was moving his powerful frame, launching across the space with devastating speed. The knife wielder went down hard, the dog's attack executed with surgical precision, the weapon skittering across the pavement. "That was a mistake," David said, his voice now carrying an edge of steel. The dogs shifted their positions slightly, creating a perimeter around the fallen gang members, their training, their lethality on full display. These weren't pets responding to threats. These were military assets, precisely honed weapons, and the gang was starting to understand just how outmatched they truly were. "You had your chance to walk away," David continued. "Now you get to live with the consequences." Snake made one last, desperate attempt to salvage his authority, his voice cracking as he tried to rally his broken gang. "You think you can protect everyone, old man. You can't be everywhere. We'll be back." David's lips curved in a slight smile that held no warmth, no humor. "You still don't get it, E," said softly. "I don't need to be everywhere. The gang's reputation is already destroyed. Who's going to follow you now? Who's going to believe in your strength after tonight?" The words struck home. He could hear the sharp intake of breath from several gang members, the way their confidence crumbled completely. A low growl from Rex cut through the night air, the dog's acute senses picking up movement from the shadows. David hadn't missed it either. his enhanced hearing tracking two more gang members, trying to circle around behind him. They froze as Shadow turned toward them, the dog's powerful frame blocking their path. This wasn't going to be like the movies. No last-minute surprise attacks. No desperate final stands David and his dogs had controlled. The situation from the moment they arrived. The sirens were closer now, their wail cutting through the night, but David wasn't finished. He moved forward, his steps precise, calculated, until he stood directly in front of Snake. "You're going to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying absolute authority. "You're going to take what's left of your gang, and you're going to disappear. Because if you don't, if you ever threaten this community again, what happened tonight will seem like a pleasant memory." Atlas, Rex, and Shadow moved with him, their bodies creating a wall of controlled aggression, their training, their capability on full display. Snake stumbled backward, his boots scraping against the pavement as he tried to put distance between himself and this impossible opponent. "You're crazy," he gasped, but there was no conviction in his voice, only fear. David didn't respond, didn't need to. The message had been delivered. The gang's power, their illusion of invincibility, had been shattered completely. The police were almost there now, their vehicles turning onto the street, but David was already moving, the dogs falling into formation around him. They had done what needed to be done, had shown these predators that they had chosen the wrong territory to hunt in. As they walked away, David could hear the gang members struggling to their feet, could sense the deep shift that had occurred in their understanding of the world. They had walked into this neighborhood, thinking they were the apex predators, had never imagined they would encounter something like him. Mrs. Chen's voice carried after him, shaking with emotion and awe. "Thank you," she called out. Mr. Chen adding something in Mandarin that carried both gratitude and reverence. David didn't turn, didn't acknowledge. Their words, he didn't need their thanks. This wasn't about recognition or glory. This was about protection, about maintaining the peace he had fought so hard to find. The dogs moved silently beside him. Their mission completed their energy, still humming, with controlled power. The night air carried the sounds of approaching police cars, of gang members being questioned, of a community beginning to emerge from its fear. But David's mind was already shifting forward. This confrontation had changed things, had revealed what lay beneath the surface of his quiet existence. The warrior he had tried to leave behind had emerged again, and now everyone would know that the blind veteran with his 3 dogs was something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The aftermath of that night spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, stories passing from person to person, each telling, adding new layers of awe and disbelief to what had transpired. David could hear the whispers as he made his morning rounds with the dogs, could sense the shift in how people perceived him. Gone was the subtle pity, replaced by something deeper, a mix of respect and wonder that followed in his wake. The blind veteran who had systematically dismantled a notorious gang with nothing but his dogs and his own mysterious skills. The police investigation had been brief, perfunctory. The gang members too shaken, too humiliated to press charges or even provide coherent statements about what had happened. Some had disappeared, entirely fleeing the neighborhood as soon as they could walk, while others nursed their wounds and their shattered pride in silence. The official report mentioned a disturbance at Chen's market, but the full story of what had transpired that night lived only in the whispered conversations of those who had witnessed it. David maintained his routine, the daily walks, the stops at Sarah's coffee shop, the quiet moments on his porch. But everything had changed. Atlas, Rex, and Shadow were no longer seen as just service dogs. The community now understood they were something far more lethal, their military bearing their precise movements, telling a story of combat and warfare that most civilians could barely comprehend. David could hear the change in people's voices when they spoke to him, the new undertone of awareness that beneath his calm exterior lay a warrior. Sarah had decorated the coffee shop with a small American flag, a subtle tribute to David's service, though she never mentioned it directly. He could hear the pride in her voice when she served him. His usual coffee could sense the way other customers watched him with newfound respect. The gang's attempt to extort protection money had stopped completely. Not just at her shop, but throughout the neighborhood the message had been received and understood there was already protection here far more effective than anything the gang could have provided. Mr. Chen had recovered from his injuries, his voice stronger now when he greeted David each morning. The old man had always treated him with respect, but there was something new in their interactions, a deeper understanding Mr. Chen had seen firsthand. What lay beneath the surface of the quiet, blind veteran had witnessed the lethal efficiency that years of special operations training had instilled you. "Saved us all," he said simply one morning, his voice carrying emotions that transcended language. David had simply nodded, accepting the words without comment. The dogs seemed to sense the change as well, their movements through the neighborhood carrying a new purpose. They had revealed their true nature, their military training no longer completely hidden beneath the facade of service animals, and yet they maintained their discipline, their precise formations, their constant vigilance. Atlas still led Shadow and Rex, following in perfect coordination, their bodies always positioned to protect, their handler though now. Everyone understood this arrangement wasn't about helping a blind man navigate, but about tactical efficiency. Late at night, David would sit on his porch listening to the sounds of his neighborhood, the patterns of life returning. To normal but with subtle differences, the gang's motorcycles no longer rumbled through the streets. Their presence erased as completely as if they had never existed in their place, was a new kind of peace. One built on the understanding that this quiet community had a guardian. Someone who could face down threats with lethal efficiency when necessary. The dogs would lay at his feet, their bodies relaxed, but alert, their training never fully dormant. Sometimes in these quiet moments, David's mind would drift back to Afghanistan, to the missions that had shaped him, the combat operations where he and his dogs had earned their reputation, the training that had turned his blindness from a weakness into a strength he hadn't wanted to reveal. That part of himself had hoped to leave the warrior behind and find peace in anonymity, but the gang had forced, his hand had threatened the community he had sworn to protect, and in doing so had unleashed something they couldn't possibly have understood. Mrs. Henderson still brought him cookies, chatted about neighborhood gossip, but her voice carried a new note of confidence, the fear that had tainted her words during the gang's reign of terror completely gone. "You know," she said one afternoon as Atlas accepted a treat with gentle dignity, "they say you were some kind of special forces hero." David didn't confirm or deny, letting the silence speak for itself. He had never sought recognition, had no desire to discuss his military service. But he understood the community's need to make sense of what they had witnessed. The younger children still waved as they passed, still called out greetings to the dogs, but their parents watched with new eyes, understanding now that these weren't just pets, that the blind veteran wasn't just another disabled member of their community. David could hear their whispered conversations, the way they spoke about him with a mixture of awe and gratitude, the story of that night growing with each telling until it had become almost mythical, a tale of justice served of evil, confronted and defeated by an unlikely hero. But David knew the truth was both simpler and more complex than the stories suggested. He wasn't a hero, wasn't seeking glory or recognition. He was simply a warrior who had found a new mission protecting this small corner of the world. The skills that had made him legendary in combat. The training that had forged him and his dogs into lethal weapons. These were tools, nothing more, means to an... And the gang had learned this lesson. The hard way, had discovered that sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one they never saw coming. The neighborhood had changed, not just in its freedom from the gang's influence, but in its understanding of strength of protection. The quiet, blind veteran with his 3 dogs had become a symbol of something deeper, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that true power often lay hidden beneath the surface. David continued his routines, maintained his quiet presence. But now everyone understood that the peace they enjoyed wasn't just the result of good fortune. It was protected, maintained by someone who had seen the worst humanity could offer and had chosen to stand against it. The days following the confrontation brought a new rhythm to the neighborhood, a sense of peace that went deeper than mere absence of threat. David could feel it in the way people moved in their voices, in the subtle shifts of energy that his enhanced senses detected. But beneath this tranquility he remained vigilant, his military training never allowing him to fully relax. Atlas, Rex, and Shadow maintained their watchful presence, their bodies always positioned for maximum coverage, their senses as sharp as their handlers. Word had spread beyond the immediate neighborhood, stories of the blind veteran and his military dogs reaching other parts of the city. David could hear snippets of conversation as people passed his house, whispered accounts of that night growing more elaborate, with each telling some spoke of him as a ghost, a shadow that had materialized from nowhere to destroy. A gang that had seemed invincible, others painted him as a legendary special forces operator whose blindness had only made him more lethal. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. The police had increased their patrols in the area more for show than necessity. David noted the pattern of their movements, the regularity of their passes, but he knew the real security came from elsewhere. The gang's complete disappearance had created a vacuum, but no other criminal elements moved to fill it. The story of what had happened to Snake and his crew had spread through the underground network of the city's darker elements, a cautionary tale about underestimating seemingly vulnerable targets. Sarah's coffee shop was busier than ever, the morning crowd returning with renewed confidence, the atmosphere charged with a different kind of energy. David sat at his usual table, the dogs arranged around him in their standard formation, but now customers watched them with new understanding. These weren't just service animals. They were weapons, precisely honed instruments of warfare disguised as companions. Sarah herself moved with a new lightness in her step, her voice carrying none of the fear that had plagued it during the gang's reign. Mr. Chen had reopened his market. The signs of the confrontation erased, but the memory of that night lived on in the way he spoke to David, in the respect that colored every interaction the old man had witnessed, something few civilians ever saw: the lethal efficiency of a special operations veteran, the devastating coordination of a military K-9 unit operating at peak performance. "You remind me of the warriors from old stories," Mr. Chen said one morning, his voice carrying a weight of understanding that transcended cultural boundaries. The dogs seemed to sense the change in their environment, their movements through the neighborhood still precise, still tactical, but with a different energy. They no longer needed to hide their training, their military bearing now obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. Atlas maintained point position, his powerful frame always slightly ahead of David, while Rex and Shadow moved in perfect synchronization, creating a mobile perimeter that nothing could penetrate without their awareness. David's enhanced hearing picked up the subtle changes in how people responded to their presence, the sharp intakes of breath when someone recognized them, the whispered conversations that followed in their wake. He had never sought attention, had spent years cultivating the image of a quiet, disabled veteran. But now that image had been irreversibly altered. The warrior had emerged, and there was no way to hide him again. Not that it mattered. The community had accepted this new reality, had embraced the protection it represented. Late at night, as David sat on his porch, listening to the quiet sounds of the neighborhood, his mind would sometimes drift to the future. He had revealed himself, had shown what lay beneath the surface of his carefully constructed anonymity. The implications of that decision would ripple outward, affecting not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. The dogs sensed these moments of contemplation, their bodies pressing closer, offering the silent support that came from years of shared combat experience. Mrs. Henderson still brought him news of the neighborhood, but now her gossip carried different undertones. "They say the gang tried to set up in another part of the city," she told him one morning. "But no one would work with them after what happened." Here, David didn't respond, didn't need to. The message he had sent that night had spread far beyond the immediate confrontation, had become something larger, a warning to anyone who thought they could prey on the vulnerable. The younger residents of the neighborhood had started walking straighter, their steps more confident. The fear that had pervaded their lives during the gang's presence completely erased. David could hear it in their voices, in the way they moved through the streets with Renewed purpose, they had seen what real strength looked like, had witnessed the difference between intimidation and true power. The lesson would stay with them, shaping their understanding of justice and protection. Atlas, Rex, and Shadow had become symbols in their own right, their presence no longer causing concern, but inspiring a sense of security. David could hear parents pointing them out to their children, explaining in hushed tones about military working dogs, about service and sacrifice. The stories weren't always accurate, but the underlying truth remained. These weren't ordinary animals. They were warriors who had fought alongside their handler in the world's darkest places, and now stood guard over this quiet neighborhood. The change wasn't just in how others saw them, but in how the community functioned as a whole. David's acute senses detected a new solidarity, a strengthening of bonds between neighbors. People looked out for each other. More reported suspicious activity shared. Resources the gang's attempt to divide and conquer had backfired spectacularly. Instead of breaking the community, it had united them under the protection of someone they now understood was far more than he appeared. David maintained his routines. The morning walks, the quiet moments in the coffee shop, the careful patrol of his territory, but everything carried new meaning. Now, he was no longer just the blind veteran with his service dogs. He was a guardian, a protector, someone who had brought peace not through violence alone, but through the promise of consequences for those who would threaten the innocent. The warrior he had tried to leave behind had found a new purpose, a new mission, and the community had embraced both the man and the myth he had become. The long-term impact of that night rippled through the community like waves in a still pond, changing everything it touched. David could sense it in ways others might miss his enhanced hearing, picking up the subtle shifts. In conversation, the way people carried themselves, the new rhythm of life that had emerged in the wake of the gang's destruction. What had started as a simple act of protection had evolved into something larger, a transformation that affected everyone. Who called this neighborhood home Mr. Chen's Market had become a symbol of resilience. The old man's story, shared in hushed tones among customers, David would hear them as he made his morning rounds with the dog's snippets of conversation that painted him as something between a guardian angel and a vengeful spirit. The truth, as always, was more complex, more human, but the mythology served its purpose, creating a protective shield around the community that went beyond mere physical security. The gang's defeat had shown everyone that they weren't helpless, that protection could come from unexpected sources. Atlas, Rex, and Shadow had adapted to their new status, their military training no longer completely hidden, but still carefully controlled. David had adjusted their routines slightly, allowing them to display more of their capability, while maintaining the discipline that made them so effective. They moved through the neighborhood like silent guardians, their presence alone enough to deter any thoughts of criminal activity, their coordination with their handler, a constant reminder of the lethal efficiency they were capable of. The coffee shop had become a gathering place again, but with a different energy Sarah had installed. A small plaque near the counter, a simple thing that read, "Protected and served." David never mentioned it, never acknowledged it directly, but his enhanced hearing picked up the way customers would pause to read it, their voices carrying notes of understanding and respect. The gang's attempt to extort protection money had backfired spectacularly. Instead of breaking the community's spirit, it had revealed the true meaning of protection. David's daily routines remained largely unchanged, but carried new significance. Now he wasn't just maintaining his territory, he was providing a visible reminder that someone was watching, someone capable of defending the community with lethal efficiency. If necessary, his presence had become both reassurance and warning. His dark glasses and white cane, no longer symbols of vulnerability, but badges of a different kind of strength. The kind that came from turning perceived weakness into devastating advantage. The dogs seemed to understand their expanded role, their movements through the neighborhood still precise, still tactical, but with an added dimension of awareness. Atlas would pause occasionally, his powerful frame alert as children approached. Wanting to pet him, David would allow these interactions carefully controlled moments that helped bridge the gap between their military capability and their role as community guardians. Rex and Shadow would maintain their positions, their training, never faltering, but their presence helping to normalize the idea that protection could wear many faces. Late at night, David would sit on his porch, listening to the subtle sounds of his neighborhood, the patterns of life that had emerged in the wake of change. He could hear families walking together without fear, couples enjoying evening strolls, the normal activities of a community that had rediscovered its confidence. The dogs would lay at his feet, their bodies relaxed but alert, their senses, still scanning for any sign of threat. It was different now. They weren't just waiting for danger. They were maintaining the peace they had helped create. The younger generation had been particularly affected by the events. David could hear it in their voices, in the way they spoke about strength and protection. Gone was the false bravado, the admiration for gang culture replaced by a deeper understanding of what real power looked like. They had seen someone stand up against intimidation, had witnessed the difference between thuggish posturing and trained capability. The lesson had stuck, changing how they viewed their own place in the community. Mrs. Henderson still brought him updates on neighborhood happenings, but her gossip now carried different weight. "You know," she said one afternoon, "they're talking about starting a neighborhood watch program." David nodded, listening, as she explained how people wanted to take more responsibility for their community's safety. It wasn't about vigilantism or confrontation, but about organization, about neighbors looking out for each other, the kind of strength that came from unity rather than fear. The police had adjusted their approach to the neighborhood as well. David's acute hearing picked up the respect in their voices. When they passed, the professional courtesy extended from one protector to another. They never officially acknowledged what had happened that night. But their actions spoke volumes, the way they consulted him subtly about community matters, the increased patrols that seemed more about showing support than maintaining order. Atlas, Rex, and Shadow had become more than just dogs, more than even military assets. They were symbols of something larger, a reminder that protection didn't always come in expected forms. David could hear parents explaining to their children about service, about duty, about the different ways people could serve their community. The dogs accepted these interactions with military discipline, their training, allowing them to be both approachable and formidable, a balance that helped bridge understanding. The community had learned other lessons, too subtle but important changes in how they handled problems, how they supported each other. David's enhanced senses detected the strengthening of neighborhood bonds, the way people reached out to those in need. The increased communication between residents. They had seen what was possible when they stood together, had learned that vulnerability didn't mean weakness, that sometimes the quietest among them could be the strongest. David maintained his vigilance, his training never allowing him to become complacent. But the nature of his watch had evolved. It wasn't just about protecting against physical threats anymore. It was about maintaining the new spirit that had emerged in the community, the confidence, the unity, the sense of shared purpose. The warrior he had been forced to reveal had found a different kind of mission, showing others that true strength often came in unexpected forms, that sometimes the best defense was building something worth protecting. As the seasons changed, the neighborhood continued to evolve, adapting to its new reality. David could sense it in every interaction, every conversation, every quiet moment of community life. What had started as a simple act of protection had grown into something larger, a transformation that went beyond the defeat of a gang. It had become about rediscovering what community meant, about understanding that true security came not just from having a protector, but from becoming stronger together. The blind veteran and his military dogs had shown them the way, but the path forward was one they would walk together. The final days of autumn brought a different kind of quiet to the neighborhood, a peace that went beyond mere absence of threat. David sat on his porch in the gathering dusk, Atlas, Rex, and Shadow arranged around him in their standard formation, his enhanced hearing picking up the subtle sounds of community life. the laughter of children playing without fear, the casual conversations of neighbors walking together, the normal activities of people who no longer lived in the shadow of intimidation. The transformation was complete, but David knew better than to think the story was over. His military training had taught him that peace was something that required constant vigilance, constant maintenance. The gang was gone, their influence erased, but human nature remained unchanged. There would always be those who sought to prey on the vulnerable, who mistook kindness for weakness. His role had evolved from warrior to guardian, the protector who stood watch, not from obligation, but from understanding. Sarah's coffee shop had become more than just a business. It was a symbol of resilience, of community strength. David could hear it in the conversations that flowed around his usual table, the way people spoke about belonging, about protection, about the difference between fear and respect. The dogs maintained their positions, alert but calm, their presence, a reminder that security came in many forms, that sometimes the most effective deterrent was the quiet certainty of response rather than the threat of violence. Mr. Chen had recovered fully his market once again, the heart of the neighborhood, but changed, strengthened by what had happened. The old man understood something now that went beyond the simple dynamics of business and community. He had seen firsthand the difference between intimidation and protection, had witnessed the transformation of a quiet, blind veteran into something that transcended ordinary definitions of strength. "You give us all hope," he told David one morning, his voice carrying the weight of deep understanding. The dogs had adapted to their expanded role, their military training now an open secret that served to reassure rather than intimidate. Atlas would acknowledge greetings from regular customers with dignified acceptance, while Rex and Shadow maintained their patrol positions, their coordination with David a constant reminder of years spent in combat zones where trust and teamwork meant the difference between life and death. They were more than weapons. Now they were symbols of a different kind of security. David's enhanced senses picked up the subtle changes in how the community functioned, the strengthened bonds between neighbors, the increased awareness of shared responsibility. People looked out for each other. More reported suspicious activity took pride in maintaining the peace that had been won at such cost. The gang's attempt to divide and conquer had created something stronger than they could have imagined, a unity based not on fear but on mutual support and understanding. The younger residents of the neighborhood walked with new confidence there, steps carrying purpose rather than bravado. David could hear it in their voices, in the way they spoke about protection, about service, about the difference between true strength and mere intimidation. They had seen something remarkable, had witnessed the transformation of perceived weakness into devastating capability. The lesson had changed how they viewed themselves and their place in the community. Mrs. Henderson still brought him news, still shared the neighborhood gossip. But now her stories carried different themes. "They talk about you, you know," she said one afternoon as Atlas accepted a treat with gentle dignity, "about how you changed everything." David didn't respond, didn't need to. The community understood now that some things went beyond words, that sometimes the quietest presence could be the most powerful. The police had adjusted their approach, had come to see the neighborhood differently. David's acute hearing picked up the respect in their voices when they passed, the professional courtesy extended from one protector to another. They never officially acknowledged what had happened that night, but their actions spoke volumes, the way they consulted him subtly about community matters, the increased patrols that seemed more about showing support than maintaining order late at night. As the neighborhood settled into sleep, David would sit on his porch listening to the quiet sounds of peace, the dogs alert but relaxed beside him, his mind sometimes drifting to Afghanistan, to the missions that had shaped him, the training that had turned his blindness from weakness into strength. He hadn't chosen this role, hadn't sought to become a symbol of protection, but circumstances had forced. His hand had revealed what lay beneath the surface of his carefully constructed anonymity. The warrior he had tried to leave behind had found a new purpose, a new mission, protecting not just a territory but a community. The skills that had made him legendary in combat had been transformed, adapted to serve a different kind of battle. The gang's defeat had been necessary, but it was what came after that truly mattered. The way people had come together, had rediscovered their own strength under the quiet guidance of someone who understood that true power often lay in restraint as winter approached, bringing shorter days and longer nights. David maintained his vigilance, his routines unchanged, but carrying deeper meaning. Now he was no longer just the blind veteran with his service dogs. He was a guardian, a protector, someone who had shown that peace wasn't just the absence of threat, but the presence of something stronger. The community had changed, had grown, had learned lessons that went beyond the simple dynamics of power and fear. They had seen what was possible when people stood together, when they refused to be divided by intimidation. The story would be told and retold, growing with each telling. But the truth remained simpler and more profound than any legend. David Marshall and his dogs had done more than defeat a gang. They had helped create something lasting, something that went beyond physical security. They had shown that true strength often came from unexpected sources, that sometimes the most powerful force in a community was the quiet presence of someone who understood the real meaning of protection. The warrior had found peace not by laying down his weapons, but by using them to defend something worth protecting. The neighborhood had found its new rhythm, its peace secured by more than just the absence of threat. As David sat on his porch that evening, Atlas Rex and Shadow arranged in their usual formation, he reflected on how far they had come, the lessons learned, the strength discovered. His enhanced hearing picked up the sounds of community life, people walking without fear, children playing in the growing dusk, neighbors greeting each other with genuine warmth. A motorcycle engine rumbled in the distance, different from the gang's aggressive machines. This was just a commuter heading home, David's. Acute senses tracked it automatically, a habit born from years of combat training. The dog's ears twitched in unison, but remained relaxed, their military bearing now an accepted part of the neighborhood's character. They had all found their place. In this new reality, their roles evolved from weapons to guardians. Sarah's coffee shop bustled with evening customers, their conversations carrying across the cooling air to David's enhanced hearing. They spoke of normal things of daily life, of plans, and hopes no longer dominated by fear or worry of gang reprisals. The protection money demands were a distant memory replaced by a different kind of security, one built on community strength and the quiet presence of someone who understood what real protection meant. Mr. Chen passed by on his evening walk, pausing to exchange greetings, his voice carrying the respect that came from witnessing something extraordinary. The old man had seen firsthand what lay beneath the surface of the quiet, blind veteran had watched, as carefully constructed anonymity gave way to revealed strength. "We are blessed to have you," he said simply before continuing on his way. David nodded, accepting the words without comment, understanding that some things went beyond verbal response. The dogs shifted slightly, their bodies realigning as they picked up movement from the shadows, but it was just Mrs. Henderson making her way home, arms full of groceries. The community had changed in subtle ways. People looked out for each other more, reported suspicious activity, shared resources. The gang's attempt to divide them had created something stronger than they could have imagined, a unity based not on fear, but on mutual support and understanding. David's mind drifted to Afghanistan, to the missions that had shaped him, the training that had turned his blindness from weakness into strength. He hadn't chosen this role, hadn't sought to become a symbol of protection, but circumstances had forced his hand, had revealed what lay beneath the surface. He was no longer just the blind veteran with his service dogs. He was a guardian, a protector, someone who had shown that peace wasn't just the absence of threat, but the presence of something stronger. The community had changed, had grown, had learned lessons that went beyond the simple dynamics of power and fear. They had seen what was possible when people stood together, when they refused to be divided by intimidation. The story would be told and retold, growing with each telling. But the truth remained simpler and more profound than any legend. David Marshall and his dogs had done more than defeat a gang. They had helped create something lasting, something that went beyond physical security. As night settled over the neighborhood, David stood preparing to head inside the dogs, moving in perfect formation beside him. His enhanced hearing picked up the distant sound of police sirens, but they were heading elsewhere. This quiet corner of the world had found its peace, had discovered its strength under the protection of someone who understood that true security came not from fear, but from community, from people standing together against those who would prey on the vulnerable. The warrior he had tried to leave behind had found a new purpose, a new mission, protecting not just a territory, but a way of life. The skills that had made him legendary in combat had been transformed, adapted to serve a different kind of battle. Atlas pressed against his leg, a gesture of completion. As they turned toward the door, this wasn't the end of their story, but it was the beginning of something different, something stronger than any gang could hope to defeat. David paused in his doorway, his unseeing eyes hidden behind dark glasses. But his other senses painting a perfect picture of his neighborhood, the sounds of families settling in for the evening, the quiet conversations, the normal activities of people who had rediscovered their confidence, their sense of security, the dogs, arranged around him, alert but relaxed, understanding that their role too had evolved from weapons to guardians of peace. This was their legacy, not just the defeat of those who would threaten the innocent, but the creation of something stronger, something that would last long after the stories of that night had faded into legend. David Marshall and his dogs had shown that true strength often came from unexpected sources, that sometimes the most powerful force in a community was the quiet presence of someone who understood the real meaning of protection. They had found their peace not by laying down their weapons, but by using them to defend something worth protecting. The night air carried the promise of coming winter, but the warmth of community strength remained unchanged, unshaken. David closed his door, the sound echoing softly through the quiet street, his enhanced senses still monitoring his territory, still standing guard, but with a different purpose now. They had all found their place in this new reality, their roles transformed by circumstance and choice. The warrior had found his peace, the community had found its strength, and together they had created something that would endure. If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us bring more incredible tales of courage, strength, and redemption. Don't forget to leave a comment, letting us know what you think, and share this video with others who might find inspiration in these remarkable stories. Until next time, remember that true strength often comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the quietest among us carry the most powerful stories.